The perfect weapon. The war against humanity had dragged on longer than the Xelthari High Command had anticipated. Their fleet was technologically superior, their soldiers stronger, their strategies refined through centuries of conquest. And yet, humans resisted, harder than any species before them. They weren't the largest, the strongest, or the most advanced, but they were relentless. Even when outgunned, they fought. Even when surrounded, they refused to surrender. Even when beaten, they came back stronger. That was why Varesh had developed the Mind Control Serum, a solution to the problem of human defiance. Varesh stood in the observation chamber of Facility Prime, a sterile metallic research station orbiting a barren moon. Below, a group of human test subjects sat in a containment cell, unaware they had already been injected. The serum had been perfected over decades, used to pacify and enslave countless species across the galaxy. The humans would be no different. High Command had doubted him. They had insisted humans were too chaotic, too unpredictable. But Varesh knew better. Their minds might have been resistant to conventional control, but chemical precision would break them like all the others. He turned to Overseer Drell, the Xelthari military official overseeing the project. The Overseer's exoskeletal plates shifted, a sign of anticipation. "How long until we see results?" Drell asked. "Moments," Varesh replied, gesturing toward the containment cell. "It will begin subtly, loss of defiance, obedience setting in, their thoughts aligning to the will of authority." Inside the cell, 6 humans sat, their wrists bound with energy restraints. They had been captured after a skirmish on an outpost world, chosen specifically for this test. Among them was Captain Elias Voss, a Special Forces operative. Varesh had read his file: decorated soldier, exceptional strategist, dangerously willful. The perfect subject. If the serum worked on him, it would work on all of them. The humans had been unruly at first, yelling, demanding answers, threatening violence. But now they were calm, silent. Compliance was setting in. Drell exhaled in satisfaction. "It appears your serum works after all." Varesh allowed himself a small nod. "Of course." And then Elias Voss looked up. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were not vacant like the others. They were focused, sharp, aware. He studied his fellow prisoners, then slowly turned his gaze toward the observation window, as if he could see them. A slow, unsettling grin spread across his face. Varesh felt something strange, a flicker of unease, something he hadn't felt in years. "Something is wrong," he muttered. Drell scoffed. "They're sitting still, not even speaking. They're broken." "No," Varesh said slowly, his mandibles clicking in discomfort. "They're thinking." Elias leaned toward the human beside him, whispering something. The other human nodded. Then another. Then another. Varesh tapped into the biometric scanners, expecting to see slowed neurological activity, a sign of compliance. Instead, he saw the opposite. Brain activity was spiking, not just normal levels, beyond normal levels. Heart rates were steady. Adrenaline was rising. And yet, there was no panic, no fear. They were not succumbing. They were adapting. Drell stiffened. "Explain this." Varesh stared at the data. It made no sense. The serum should suppress their cognitive independence, aligning them to external directives. This is impossible. Inside the cell, Elias Voss stood up, energy restraints still binding his wrists. He turned toward the observation window and tilted his head, as if listening to something unseen. Then he spoke. "Is this the best you've got?" His voice was steady, controlled, not the voice of a broken prisoner, but a man who had just won a battle none of them knew they were fighting. Varesh's breath caught. "Restrain them. Now." Security drones whirred to life, moving toward the containment cell. Elias didn't flinch. He merely glanced at the others, and in eerie synchrony, they all stood up. Their movements were too smooth, too synchronized. And then the restraints on Elias's wrists unlocked. Not broken, not hacked, released. Varesh's mandibles trembled. The humans had taken control. Drell slammed his fist onto the console. "Shut it down." The drones fired stun pulses, but before the shots could connect, Elias raised a hand, and the pulses halted in midair. A low hum filled the room as the energy reversed direction, slamming back into the drones, frying their circuits instantly. The humans turned toward the observation window, not with rage, not with defiance, but with understanding. Elias smiled. "Thank you," he said. "We needed a little push." And then the lights flickered, the first sign that Facility Prime no longer belonged to the Xelthari. The unintended consequences. Varesh staggered back from the observation window, his mind racing. This was impossible. The Mind Control Serum had been perfected over centuries. It had subdued entire species, reducing them to obedient thralls. There was no record, no precedent of resistance, let alone adaptation. And yet, the humans were not only resisting, they were changing. Elias Voss stood in the containment cell, his restraints undone, his stance unshaken. Around him, the other humans moved in eerie synchronization, exchanging glances and nods without a word. Varesh's claws trembled over the console. He pulled up their biometric data. The numbers didn't lie. Brain activity elevated, neural connectivity spiking, adrenaline levels stable. They weren't experiencing normal neurological suppression. They were experiencing something new. "What is happening?" Overseer Drell hissed, his armored plates shifting in agitation. "Why aren't they complying?" Varesh barely heard him. He was too busy analyzing the real-time neural scans. The serum was designed to suppress independent thought, ensuring compliance. But instead, it was rewiring human minds, enhancing them. The humans weren't losing their will. They were gaining something else entirely. A flicker of motion caught his attention. Elias lifted his hand. His fingers curled into a fist, and the security feed glitched. Just for a moment, a flicker of distortion. Then, one of the test subjects, a young woman named Lieutenant Camila Ortega, turned toward the door. It should have been locked, but as she reached for it, the control panel deactivated on its own. The door slid open. "No," Varesh whispered. Drell slammed his fist on the alarm controls. "Shut down the facility. Gas the chamber if you have to." Varesh hesitated. "If we do that, we might lose the only chance to understand." "I said do it." Before Varesh could react, Elias turned his head toward the observation window, locking eyes with him. Then, he spoke directly into Varesh's mind. "You're afraid. You should be." Varesh reeled back, his mandibles clicking in sheer disbelief. Telepathic projection? That wasn't possible. Humans weren't telepaths. They had never demonstrated such abilities. And yet, Elias's voice had been clear inside his head. Drell's mandibles flared. "I don't care what's happening. Send in the enforcers. Kill them if you have to." Varesh hesitated again. This was wrong. The Xelthari had faced rebellions before, had crushed resistance with superior force. But this was different. The serum had not subdued them. It had evolved them. The facility doors hissed open as a squad of Xelthari enforcers stormed in, their weapons leveled. Elias didn't move. Neither did Ortega. Neither did any of them. The enforcers raised their rifles. And then they stopped. Not because of orders. Not because of hesitation. But because their hands would not obey them. Their weapons trembled in their claws. Their fingers refused to squeeze the triggers. One of them, a veteran warrior named Subcommander Redhiz, began to shake violently. And then he turned his rifle on his own squad. "Impossible," Varesh whispered. The enforcers started firing on each other, screaming in confusion, unable to resist the unseen force twisting their actions. The sound of energy fire echoed through the chamber, but not a single shot was aimed at the humans. Elias exhaled slowly. "You shouldn't have tried to control us," he said, his voice filled with cold understanding. Varesh's claws dug into the console. "This isn't control," he whispered. "It's infection." Drell snapped his mandibles. "What are you saying?" Varesh's eyes remained locked on the chaos unfolding below. The serum didn't suppress them. It linked them. It's turned them into something more. The human prisoners stepped over the bodies of the fallen enforcers, calm and unhurried. Elias reached toward one of the dying Xelthari, placing a hand on his forehead. The soldier stopped struggling. Then, in the silence, he turned his gaze upward toward Varesh and Drell. And he smiled. Drell recoiled. What is that?" Varesh felt his stomach churn. The implications were terrifying. The humans weren't just resisting control. They were hijacking it. The Xelthari weren't the ones infecting them. The humans were infecting the Xelthari. Elias looked up toward the observation deck one last time. His voice echoed, not just in the chamber, but inside Varesh's skull. "You thought you were making slaves. Instead, you made something much worse." The station lights flickered, the first sign that control was no longer in the hands of the Xelthari. And in that moment, Varesh realized the horrifying truth. They had not created a weapon to control humanity. They had created their own destruction, turning the tables. Varesh stumbled back from the console, his claws shaking. He was a scientist, not a soldier. He had spent years perfecting the Mind Control Serum, refining its effects to break the will of countless species. Never had he imagined it would backfire like this. But there was no denying what he had seen. The humans had turned the serum against them. Elias Voss and his people moved through the corridors of Facility Prime, unarmed yet completely unchallenged. The Xelthari soldiers, the same ones trained to crush resistance without hesitation, now stood frozen, their weapons slack in their claws, their movements sluggish and uncertain. Some turned and fled without even knowing why. Others clutched their heads, struggling against an unseen force that was burrowing into their minds, unraveling their obedience from within. Varesh turned to Overseer Drell, his superior, his voice a whisper of panic. "We have to evacuate." Drell's mandibles snapped in fury. "No, we wipe this station before this disease spreads." Disease. That was what this was. It had started as a serum meant to enslave. Instead, it had bound the humans together in a way the Xelthari had never seen before. A collective intelligence, a unity of will. And worse, it was contagious. Varesh's mind reeled as he pieced together what was happening. The serum had rewritten human neural pathways, but instead of making them compliant, it had enhanced their ability to influence others. Now, when humans spoke, Xelthari listened. When humans focused, Xelthari obeyed. And when humans willed it, Xelthari minds cracked under the pressure. Drell wasn't listening. His claws hammered the security panel, overriding protocols to initiate a station-wide purge. The emergency lockdown klaxons blared. Purge initiated. All biological entities will be terminated in 300 seconds. Varesh felt a cold dread settle into his bones. "You fool," Drell snarled. "We lose the station, we lose the research. We cannot allow this contamination to spread." But Varesh had already realized the truth. It was too late. Across the station, Xelthari soldiers dropped their weapons and stood in eerie silence, their minds compromised. Some trembled violently before collapsing. Others, like Sub-Commander Redhiz, simply stared into nothingness, their loyalty to the Xelthari Empire crumbling into dust. And in the center of it all, Elias Voss walked forward, his eyes sharp, calmly taking control of an entire species. The doors to the control room hissed open, and Elias stepped inside. He wasn't armed. He didn't need to be. Varesh felt an invisible weight settle over his mind, like fingers brushing against the edges of his thoughts. Elias tilted his head, studying them. "You're afraid." Drell drew his sidearm and aimed it directly at Elias's head. "I don't know what you are, human, but this ends now." Elias smiled. "Go ahead," he said. "Pull the trigger." For a brief moment, silence. Drell's arm trembled. His finger twitched over the trigger. And then, his entire body locked up. His exoskeletal plates tightened. His mandibles quivered. The gun in his claw began to shake violently. And then, slowly, he turned it away from Elias. He struggled, snarled, tried to resist. But his own arm refused to obey him. "What are you?" Drell gasped. Elias's voice was calm. "We're something new." Drell's own gun turned against him, pressing under his jaw. "No," he whispered, eyes wide with terror. Elias didn't say anything. He simply watched. Drell screamed. His own claw betrayed him. His own finger pulled the trigger. A single shot rang out. Drell collapsed. The silence that followed was suffocating. Varesh couldn't move, couldn't breathe. He had just witnessed something far worse than mind control. This wasn't domination. This was assimilation. Elias turned toward him, and Varesh flinched. But the human simply smiled. Relax. I'm not going to hurt you. Varesh swallowed, his throat dry. What are you? Elias looked down at his own hands, flexing his fingers as if feeling something new coursing through him. We don't know yet, he admitted, but you helped make us. And for that, I think we should say, he tilted his head, eyes gleaming. Thank you. The klaxons blared again. Station-wide purge in 60 seconds. Varesh snapped back to reality. If the countdown hit 0, the station's self-destruct protocol would incinerate everything, humans included. He hesitated. For the first time in his life, he was terrified of what his own species had created. And yet, if this was the future, perhaps he needed to see it for himself. His claws darted across the console, canceling the purge. The alarms cut out instantly. Elias smiled. Smart choice. Varesh exhaled sharply. His legs felt weak. He had just committed treason against the Xelthari Empire. But in his heart, he knew the Xelthari had already lost, because the humans were no longer prisoners. They were the masters now, the first of many. The silence that followed the canceled purge was thick with unspoken realization. Facility Prime no longer belonged to the Xelthari. Varesh stood frozen at the control panel, his claws still hovering over the keys. The weight of what he had done, betraying his own species, settled onto him like a crushing force. He had spent years perfecting the Mind Control Serum, believing it would break humanity. Instead, it had elevated them. And now, standing in front of him, Elias Voss, the first of whatever humanity was becoming, watched with quiet satisfaction. Varesh dared to speak. You turned Drell's own mind against him. Elias nodded. Not exactly. He turned it against himself. Varesh felt his stomach twist. You mean to say he still had a choice? Elias tilted his head slightly. We all do. That was worse. Far worse. If the humans weren't simply controlling minds, but rather guiding them, influencing them, shaping thoughts in ways that felt natural, then the Xelthari had no defense. No one could fight what they believed was their own free will. Varesh took a slow step back. You're not telepathic. Not in the traditional sense. You can't force thoughts into others. No, Elias agreed. But we can amplify what's already there. The serum didn't suppress us, it linked us. And now, we can see the gaps in others. The cracks in their beliefs, their doubts, their fears. We don't force decisions. His lips curled into a knowing smile. We just nudge. A chilling realization struck Varesh. Elias hadn't made Drell turn the gun on himself. He had simply made Drell fear. Doubt. And fear did the rest. Varesh swallowed hard. The Xelthari Empire won't allow this to spread. Elias stepped forward, closing the distance between them. It's already spreading. Varesh's mind raced. How fast? How far? The serum had altered the neural pathways of every human injected. But now, it was leaping to the Xelthari through proximity, through exposure, through understanding. It wasn't a disease. It was an idea, and ideas were unstoppable. The door behind Elias hissed open, and the other human test subjects entered, their eyes gleaming with something new. They moved with quiet confidence, as if they could hear each other without speaking. And then, behind them, came the first of the Xelthari converts. Varesh recognized Sub-Commander Redhis immediately. A loyal Xelthari warrior, one of the finest soldiers in the Empire. And yet, his posture was different now. No longer rigid, no longer bound by orders. He stepped beside Elias like an equal. Varesh recoiled. No, this can't. It's not just humans anymore, Redhis said, his mandibles clicking in harmony with Elias's speech patterns. His eyes, once sharp with aggression, were now filled with something eerily calm. We see things differently now, Redhis continued. For the first time, I understand what my orders were keeping me from seeing. Varesh's breathing was ragged. It was already happening. The Xelthari weren't being forced. They were being converted, their thoughts aligning with this new collective awareness. The war against humanity was over. Because humanity wasn't humanity anymore. There was something else now. Something bigger. Something inevitable. A dull beeping sound interrupted the moment. Varesh turned to the console and felt his stomach drop. An incoming transmission. From High Command. They knew something was wrong. Elias glanced at the alert, unconcerned. Well, that didn't take long. Varesh's claws trembled over the controls. He had a choice. He could alert the Xelthari fleet, warn them of what was happening here, or he could do nothing. And that realization terrified him, because he didn't want to warn them. Somewhere, deep in his mind, the serum was already working. He could feel it. Not an invasion, not a violation, but a suggestion. A quiet, peaceful voice whispering the truth he had spent his life ignoring. The Xelthari are wrong. The Empire is blind. This is the future. Elias watched him carefully, but he didn't command Varesh to do anything. He didn't have to. Varesh reached out, slowly, and he canceled the transmission. The room was silent for a long moment. Then Elias smiled. Varesh let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His mind was calm now. His doubts gone, because now he understood. This wasn't the fall of humanity. It was the rise of something greater, and he was part of it, the first of many.